Thank you very much, Suzanne. It's certainly a great honour to be able to give this lecture. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of where we are, the Yagara and Turrbal people. And I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that for tens of thousands of years they have been interested in the biodiversity and the nature of this land. Not just stewarding the land, but also observing, as I often say, first bird watchers. I am an obsessive bird watcher. That may well come through as time progresses. But as bird watchers, you know, it's interesting, 10,000 years ago, everybody living here was a bird watcher. They knew all their birds. Toowong is named after the indigenous name for koels. Toowong, koel. They wisely named most birds onomatopoeically, which makes it much easier to understand because so many people actually understand birds because of their calls. So one might reflect what happened to us such that if I went down to Queen Street Wall and grabbed 100 people and said, "Are you a bird watcher?" How many do you think would say yes? Maybe, that's right. I'm hoping for 2, but yeah, could be none, could be 5 if I'm lucky. Maybe if you all walk down there, I can interview you. But bottom line is, we've gone from, you know, and I know this is why an organisation like this exists, from a culture and a country where everybody was a bird watcher to 2 or 3. But I will optimistically say, interest in nature, interest in biodiversity, interest in natural history is growing, and I'd like to pay my respects, as I say, to those traditional custodians for their work in natural history, science and conservation. I'm going to sort of have 3 broad parts to my talk, which is, you know, how is biodiversity and nature going in Queensland and Australia? I'm going to talk a bit about what we're doing about it, and then I'm going to talk a bit about what I think are some of the things we could be doing. And then it's going to get a little bit edgy and a little bit controversial, because I can't give a talk without being controversial. And I'm going to more or less challenge you and many other organisations on the conservation movement to think about how conservationists can be a little bit less conservative. So there was a Big Ideas radio program where I basically argue conservation is too conservative. And we need to move ahead, and it's a great time, it's a great opportunity to move ahead. So we need to think bigger scale, longer term, and why is it a great time to move ahead? Well, I'll tell you in a minute, but a few things have happened in the last couple of years that means that nature conservation is really on the up and up, and you might see the extinction rates and other things happening in conservation or the loss of habitat around where you live, but I can assure you that there's every sign that the public of Australia are getting more and more concerned about conservation, and so it's an enormous opportunity for organisations like this, but all the other organisations. And congratulations on 91 years, did you say? 93. So I was about to think BirdLife Australia has existed for 123 years, but they were called the Royal Australian Ornithological Union, and actually for the first 50 years they spent a lot of time shooting and stuffing birds. So I'm not entirely sure. It's quite distressing to see a picture of an early bird outing in the 1920s. It's sadly largely men wearing suits and ties in the bush, no doubt baking in the heat, and their idea of bird watching was to take bird shot and shoot them, stuff them, skin them and take them back to the museum. So at different times, I'd like to say as BirdLife Australia Vice President, we don't shoot birds anymore. And in fact, in the last 3 or 4 years, BirdLife Australia has entirely focused its efforts around conservation. So the peak objective of BirdLife Australia is to be a conservation organisation. In the day, it was partly a science organisation, partly a bird club, all those things that natural history groups struggle with in terms of purpose, but now their purpose is clear. Your purpose is in your title, which is very appealing, and no doubt hasn't changed for 93 years. I'm just going to quickly remind you why Australia is special. Not that you need to be reminded, but this is something I think the Australian public often forget. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, 500 years ago, 600 years ago, 700 years ago, 800 years ago, 900 years ago, 1,000 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 there is only one other country that has more endemic species than us. Does anyone want to have a guess? Indonesia. Well done. Brazil has more species, but Indonesia is the only country in the world that has more endemic species than Australia, and this is roughly true for birds, plants, insects, the lot. So we have about 8% of the species on the planet, which is not as much as, say, Brazil or Mexico, less species, but almost so much of what we have occurs nowhere else in the world. So there's almost no place in the world with a greater responsibility for biodiversity than Australia, given there's only 25 million of us looking after 8% of the world's biodiversity, much of which is endemic. And it's not just the flashy things. People often forget that our rainforests, which are relatively small, are ancient Gondwanan rainforests, because we've been wandering around on our own for 90 million years as we broke away from Gondwana and started heading north at about 2 inches a year. And for the last 30 or 40 million years, most of our biodiversity has evolved quite independently of the rest of the world. And those wet tropics, Central Eastern Ranges, rainforests, they are the last relics of the Gondwanan rainforests. So they're not gigantic like the rainforests of Indonesia and Brazil and Central Africa, but they actually hold much more deep ancient phylogenetic diversity than those other places. So by whichever way you count it, it's an incredibly special country to be in. Queensland's the most biodiverse state, of course, in all of Australia. So if anybody should be interested in this topic, it's us. And we really need to work very hard on that. How are things going, though, given we have such an incredible endowment of diversity? Well, it's interesting. The federal government recently started to review their Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which I helped with Robert Hill create in the late 1990s. So we created a specialised piece of legislation to protect threatened species. We also have created, from the University of Queensland, the Centre of Biodiversity Conservation Science, an index that tracks how threatened species are going. It's called the Threatened Species Index, TSX. Sort of like, not the ASX, which is where your shares are, but the TSX. Sort of like an index of how Australia's threatened species are going. Has anybody ever looked at the TSX? It's easy, thank you. tsx.org.au. What do you think's been happening to us? This is based on 12,000 time series of Australia's threatened species. We have about 2,000 listed threatened species. How do you think Australia's threatened species are tracking every year since the EPBC Act was created? That's right. Basically going down alarmingly, on average, 2 or 3% per year, every year for 20 years. So that's not good. You can't keep going down. If our economy was going down 2 or 3% a year, what do you think? Would any of our governments last more than 12 months? Well, it was Gough Whitlam. He was the person who apparently was threatening Australia's economy. He didn't last very long at all. But imagine if the economy was going down 2 to 3% a year. Imagine if the per capita murder rate was going up at 2 or 3% a year every year. We'd be all up in arms. But for 25 years we've tolerated a continuous decline in biodiversity. There it is, the Threatened Species Index. When I first proposed that and we created it 7 years ago, who do you think tried to stop me creating a Threatened Species Index for the nation? The federal government. They didn't want one. Strangely enough, if you want to, so you just tsx.org.au and you can find about how all groups, birds, different states, how everything's going, 12,000 time series. The new Treasurer, what's his name, Chalmers, right, just released an index of how Australia's well-being was. So normally, what do we get on the news every night? We see unemployment rates, we see inflation rates, we see interest rates. All we see is economic indicators. Occasionally somebody might talk a bit about longevity or hospital queues. So you might get the odd social or health indicator. How often have we seen Alan Kohler write up an environmental indicator? And the environment sustains the economy. The economy is a subset of the environment. How many times, does anybody remember Alan Kohler putting up an environmental indicator? We begged him actually to put up the TSX. We may well one day get there, or one of his friends. But fortunately, this government, they have some good and bad parts about this federal government. Chalmers released a State of the Nation's Wellbeing, and the Threatened Species Index, which the federal government tried to stop, is now their one indicator for biodiversity, which we created 6 or 7 years ago and have been working very hard, a whole heap of scientists, on making sure we have that indicator. So we have one indicator. It's a national indicator. You should look at those wellbeing indicators for the nation, which is a start, because as everybody loves to say, you can't manage what you can't measure. And intriguingly, when the review of the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act was happening, this is the Samuels review. Graham Samuels did that under the previous government. The review, in theory, is being enacted on by the current government. So Tanya Plibersek has promised to review this environmental legislation, which is the dominant legislation for the country. The Samuels review, which looked at how well things were performing, when Graham Samuels first took that job, I think he's a lawyer, right? Very smart person. He spoke to myself and Martine Marin from the University of Queensland. We were zooming in, and he said, is biodiversity really in trouble? So this is 2 or 3 years ago, well-educated, highly intelligent, and now a huge advocate for biodiversity. And Martine flipped open her laptop and showed him the Threatened Species Index and said, that's 12,000 time series. The ASX, I think, is a compilation of about 200 big stocks and shares. We need an economist to verify that. It's not even the full set of stocks and shares. 12,000 time series, and look what it's doing. So I think through organisations like the Biodiversity Council, which I co-chair, and other groups, the question will never be asked again, are we doing okay? It's sort of unambiguous, and we have the data, and we have many, many years of data to show things aren't going well. There was a wonderful review by Sarah Legg on the state of Australia's biodiversity. It just came out in the world's premier science journal, which is called Science, and points out that despite Australia being a wealthy country, on average we are doing worse in biodiversity than most countries in the world. Worse in biodiversity. And I think you all know the mammal story. The mammal story is profoundly disheartening. We have more than half of the world's mammal extinctions. A lot to do with feral invasives, foxes, cats, and overgrazing. So I don't want to belabour the bad side, because we could sit here and cry and whinge about the state of biodiversity in nature forever. It's not very positive. What I do want to do is talk about the upside and then what we can all do about it, because there are enormous opportunities. The upsides are, firstly, we're filthy, filthy rich. Now, everybody may not feel as though they're filthy, filthy rich, but go to the streets of Nairobi and go to most of the world. We are genuinely filthy rich as a nation. So we have the power to do all these things. We have an engaged First Nation community who ultimately will be managing and owning probably 40% of the nation. And we have very good, for example, Queensland Parks Indigenous Ranger programs, which are delivering both social, economic and environmental outcomes. And that's in contrast, let's say, to where I was working with the Nature Conservancy as their chief scientist in the United States. The engagement with Indigenous people on nature is extremely poor, extremely poor. They're never going to manage and own 40% of the United States. They'd be lucky to get 4% of the United States. Biodiversity is now becoming a big issue. Again, literally 2 days ago, the Australian Research Council released their top 4 research priorities for the nation. Top 4 research priorities. Biodiversity is one of them. Biodiversity and net zero is one of them. There's no neuroscience, there's no quantum computing, there's no medical science, there's general statements about health. So biodiversity is called out as a top 4 research priority by the nation's Australian Research Council. So people have suddenly realised that biodiversity is very interesting, and the other thing is we're not too bad at it, at biodiversity science. So there are global rankings of scientists around the world about how productive they are in various areas of science. Australia has 10 of the top 100 ecologists, biodiversity scientists, conservation scientists. 10 out of the top 100. How many should we have? Well, there's 25 million Australians. There's about 2.5 billion reasonably wealthy, well-educated people around the world. So we should have one. We should have 1 in 100. 2.5 billion divided by 25 is 1 in 100. We have 10. So that's a lot. The only countries with more is the United States and the United Kingdom, and we're just behind the United Kingdom. We've got more than Germany, we've got more than Canada, we've got more than Brazil, we've got more than China. That's how good our biodiversity science is. It's amazing. We have, in medical science, we have 1 in the top 100. In physics, I don't think we have any. Maths, we have none. So whenever you're talking to people about what is Australia good at, it's actually agricultural science and conservation science. That is actually where it's like the tennis in the 1970s. Is that when we were good at tennis last? You know, the days when we had about 5 of the world's best tennis players. At one point we even had a few good golf players. Those days are sort of gone now, right? But that's how good we are in terms of biodiversity science. So there's no problem with the science at all. We know what we need to do. And we've made it very clear, and we've repeatedly asked the federal government, if you do want to stop extinctions, which the current Labor government promised to do, and we actually signed up to that. So there's 3 things we signed up to, which was good as well. The Australian government was very, very adamant in the Convention on Biological Negotiations in Kunming and Montreal in the last year. We signed up to a whole heap of commitments. And you probably know one of them says 30 by 2030. What's 30 by 2030? That we would conserve in protected areas or some form of conservation measure 30% of the entire country by 2030. How much of Queensland is conserved? That's right, you know that number well. Well, they'll then say actually it's protected areas, formal protected areas, but it's also these other, and Mark Hockings may have talked about this last year, other environmentally area-based conservation measures. There's a horrible acronym called OECMs, which is basically Bush Heritage Australia's reserves, land for wildlife reserves. So in theory, all those parcels of land, special wildlife reserves, which aren't necessarily owned by the government, but can be owned by any and managed by individual lands, they can also count. We just haven't quite worked out how to count them and add up the area. But we're still, I think, at 12%, even if you add them up. I don't know if anybody has done all those calculations. So yes, 12%. We've got to get to 30. We'll get to 30 by 2030. Do you think Queensland's going to get to 30 by 2030? And if we did, who's going to manage it? Who's going to manage that land? I don't need to tell this organisation that we don't have enough rangers and staff on ground in our park system to look after the current park system. I mean, it's not just how big it is, it's how fire, ferals, weeds and people are managed in those parks. So do you think Queensland's going to double its protected area estate and provide for all that management in the next, well, we've only got 7 years left? Who thinks that's going to happen? Who thinks we're going to get to 30 by 2030? No. So we need to think of other things to do. Well, that's what I'm really saying. We've committed to zero extinctions, and we've committed to restoring 30% of degraded land. And of course, 30 by 2030, again, I don't need to tell this group that isn't just we're going to protect a whole heap of deserts and arid lands and stuff that nobody else wants. In theory, the real 30, and this is so important, and I think Bob Pressey gave you a lecture a few years ago. Sadly, Bob passed away a couple of months ago. He would have emphasised the importance of representation. So it's not just 30% wherever you like, it's 30% of every species distribution, 30% of every ecosystem type. And another place where Queensland is extremely lucky is we have the herbarium. The herbarium has mapped the vegetation of the state. There's 1,460 something regional ecosystems, which is amazing. mapped very accurately. That data underpins our native vegetation clearing legislation. That data also underpins what the Department of Environment Science does in terms of trying to prioritise those ecosystem types, endangered or of concern ecosystem types, that they need to target for the protected area system. So there's some very good government science and underpinning. They just don't have enough money. I think the latest 2 or 3 big extensions were funded partly by the Weiss Foundation. Who knows who the Weiss Foundation is? We do now, because they put in a pile of money. Where did that come from? Hans-Jörg Weiss, via the Nature Conservancy. And I was meeting with Hans-Jörg Weiss, and I have to say, delightfully, in the middle of Kenya, spending a week with him, working with him and his team to spend more money on protected areas all around the world, and we convinced them also, this was Kenya, protected areas, Mexico, Belize, but also the great opportunity that Australia was. And so that money comes from him because he's a multi-billionaire. But that's a B. Not a M. Remember what a billionaire is. We don't have that many of them in Australia. We have a few. None of them give to conservation. But multi-billionaires, you realise that with $1 billion, I live in Sherwood, you can buy Sherwood. You can buy even though Sherwood's stupidly overpriced suburb, except for the bits that flood, you can buy Sherwood if you've got $1 billion. Imagine being able to buy a couple of Brisbane suburbs. The amount of money we're talking about is huge, and he is devoting hundreds of millions of dollars every year to protected area expansion. So what does that tell us? What does that tell us? It tells us what I've been saying for 10 years, ever since I particularly worked with the Nature Conservancy. Tells us we told the government to stop species going extinct and meet 20 by 30 by 2030. They would need to spend $5 billion a year on the environment, and we currently spend a tenth of that. So government spending on the environment would have to increase tenfold for us to meet any of our commitments. So we said we'd do it by 2030. And what did you see out of the last federal government? Did you see a massive expansion of the amount of money spending on the environment? There was little bits and pieces, and you're never really sure when there's little bits and pieces whether they're just suckling money from another program. There's an enormous amount of very, very, very clever cost shifting that happens in Australian governments at local, state and federal levels. They rebadge things and they say they're spending more money. So let me be very clear. The Biodiversity Council, the Threatened Species Hub, we have repeatedly done the analysis. What would it cost to stop extinctions? What would it cost to make this 30 by 2030 protected area system and restore habitats to real? And it is basically that. It's at least $2 billion a year for each of $5 billion a year overall. $5 billion a year. So so you might think, that's a lot of money. I don't want to pay $5 billion a year. I don't want my taxes to go up. $5 billion a year. Or we could buy some submarines. So we're going to have 6 submarines and we're going to have no nature. And what do you think people are going to think about in 100 years' time or 50 years' time when half of our species are extinct? And we probably, by then, will have lost the 5 submarines, 6 submarines. We had 2 submarines in the First World War. Does anybody know what happened to them? My great-uncle almost stepped onto one of them off Darwin, AE1. It disappeared in the Bismarck Sea and was never seen again. The other one got captured near Turkey. So we had a go at submarines, and it didn't actually do anything at all. Now we're going to have 6 or 7 of them instead of funding nature properly. But basically that's the scale of the problem. So it's not $5 billion, again, if we walk out onto Queen Street Mall and say this is what it takes to save the entire natural heritage of an entire continent, most people would be umming and ahhing about whether we should pay for it. But we can pay for it because we're happy to pay for something that, in my opinion, is going to achieve nothing at all. I just hope we don't lose them like we lost the first 2 submarines we ever had. So we have signed up to some commitments. We do have the resources to solve the problem. The next question is, why aren't we solving the problem? And so what does a government say to you, state, federal, They say they will do anything you want them to do as long as most Australians want it. Because that's how they got elected, right? More than 50% of people voted for them. That's how governments work. And I'm going to say something a little bit controversial now. I'm very optimistic that we will turn a corner. Why am I optimistic? Because let's think about climate change. 20 years ago, very few politicians were at all concerned about climate change. Most of them didn't even believe it existed. And what have we seen now is basically both major parties in differing ways, and the vast majority of the Australian people, at least 70 or 80%, believe climate change action is urgent. And although we're decarbonising way too slowly, we're certainly going as fast as some sort of capitalist democracy allows. Okay, it's not like we're going to have a Russian 5-year plan and go into a war footing, but we're going as fast as we can, and we'll probably be decarbonised between 2040 and 2050. So, to be honest, the climate wars are actually over. I know they're not over in the sense we're still going to get 1.5 to 2.5 degrees of climate change, and it's not going to be very pleasant. It's not going to be pleasant for biodiversity. It's not going to be pleasant for our park system. It's not going to be pleasant for people who live in Brisbane because it's going to be hot. And more storms and other things, more fires. But the world is more or less, and Australia's more or less finally decided they're going to act on it. In fact, I've had 3 or 4 major donors talk to me recently who have poured their heart and soul into climate change for us, and they say we've won. So that's good. I mean, we may not all feel as though we won, and we may also feel as though we won a little bit too late. We could have taken action a lot earlier. But now they're saying they now know what the Australian Research Council knows, what all the scientists of Australia knows. There are 2 existential threats to humanity: climate change and biodiversity loss. But if I again walked out to the general public, what do you think is going to threaten humanity? They'll probably say, yes, climate change. Will they say biodiversity loss? No, of course, they won't. Very few of them will. But they're the only 2 ones. I mean, diseases, no, they kill some people. They don't destroy humanity. We just had one. And the economy blinked for 6 months. So they're not existential threats. Wiping out all the pollinators, destroying all the soil, they're existential threats. So it's going to be an interesting period. I'm very hopeful that in the next 5 to 10 years, what Australia and the rest of the world have done on climate change, which I know, as I say, the game isn't over, will start to happen for biodiversity. So I'm optimistic. Maybe I'm delusional. I don't know if any of you think the same as I have. And given I wrote my first angry letter to the newspaper about birds and habitat loss when I was 17, just 12 years ago, I've been doing this a very long time. And I wrote my first angry letter, and I've been talking to politicians and doing the science of this for my entire career. I really do feel as though we've started to turn the corner on people's passion for biodiversity. Just as a bird watcher, going out most weekends to do bird walks and see who's bird watching, just a number of people are out taking photographs of nature, insects, birds, plants, has gone up at least tenfold in the time I've been in Brisbane over the last 20 years. So the interest in nature is booming. iNaturalist, you can go and take a picture of some obscure little bug and some person will identify it for you in 3 minutes. So it's technology, it's digital photography, it's databases, so you can visualise all these maps. So the interest in natural history is booming, and young people are all very passionate about the interest in natural history. So I think we're getting there. Now, the next thing is, what should we do? Assuming we do start getting a little bit more resources, assuming that the masses of people start voting more for biodiversity. And the simplest thing is, people often say, what can I do? Well, you have to do one very simple thing that everybody can do, which is the same as voting 1,000 times, and many of you have probably done this, write to your local politician, which could be local, state or federal, but the one that's in your seat, and say, I am very concerned about whatever you want, extinctions, loss of habitat, climate change, I really would like you to do more in this space. Here's the threatened species index. Look at the data. It's not going well. This is a legacy for our children. I'd really like to have a meeting with you. And then take a friend and have a meeting and say in the first 5 minutes something nice about them. This is the hardest bit. But you can always find every politician has a maiden speech. They have them, and they're all recorded, and they will have said something good in that maiden speech. I'm sure they have. And say that you read it, because if you say you've read their maiden speech, they're going to love you so much, because nobody else has. And then say, this is what you care about. And that political power you just exerted is equivalent to a voting 1,000 times. So you never have to vote again. You can withdraw all your previous votes if you've already exerted more political power just by having that one meeting, because so few people do it. And as your local member, they more or less have to do it. But I think also we need to give people some more vision. And I'm going to give you some visions of the kinds of things we could be doing for conservation in Queensland, which aren't necessarily the traditional visions. Some of them will be the traditional visions, and some of them you might feel very uncomfortable with, and you may say, Hugh, you're a raving lunatic, but that's okay, because it's partly true. So, firstly, how do we finish this protected area system? I think a few years ago, people would have said, yes, we want more traditional, old-school national parks. These are places with a ranger station and but they're expensive and they're hard and they cost a lot of money to run. What about if we could get all the state forests into national parks? We have 3 million hectares of state forests. Queensland is 177 million hectares on the land. So that would bump us up 2%. Do you think national parks can manage all those state forests? They've partly been logged. Often they're full of lantana, have a lot of tracks and other things in them. Who would pay for all that? So what are we going to do about that? So my view is, yes, let's take the state forests, but don't make them an IUCN Category 1 or 2 park. Make them a 4 or a 6 and allow some of them should be very much, some of the tracks needs to be closed, people need to be kept out because they're high areas, but some of them should be maybe open for horse riding, mountain bike riding, even, dare I say it, some more visitor facilities and some glamping, getting people into the parks, 3 million hectares, taking the pressure off the parks we already have. So 3 million hectares of some of the most biodiverse land in Queensland could be in the park system, but I don't think we can afford it to run it like an old school park system. In fact, it may fall to pieces. It may just get ravaged by fire. So we need to give government alternatives to get people into parks, but you're right, we don't want to have thousands of horse riders and mountain bikers and lots of big paths all through our existing park system, but we need to give them a place to go. Small land trusts. So the Nature Conservancy is a global organisation, but we only worked in 80 countries. Started in the US in 1951, built by scientists, in fact. They, at various points of time, have owned or put stewardship arrangements over 4% of the entire United States. 4%. This is a not-for-profit. They own about 1% of the entire United States. Land in the United States costs at least, on average, 10 to 20 times more than land here. But not only have they done that, they've created over 200 or 300 land trusts, small land trusts. So I look around southeast Queensland and I see a lot of small blocks of scrub. Some are land for wildlife, some are other council reserves. But they have a small land trust. The Nature Conservancy doesn't want to be managing 20 hectares here and 50 hectares here. Nor does National Park. They don't want to have a small park system. But those little pockets of land in Logan City Council, in and around the Sunshine Coast with bits of rare and threatened plants and ecosystems, somebody needs to look after them. So they have many small land trusts which they have created, helped themselves set up, and they might have 150 members, they might have 5 blocks of scrub that they manage for the public, they're accessible to the public. They might have a walking trail, they might have interpretation facilities, they run as a small land trust. So we have very few land trusts. ALCA is an organisation that is coalition of land trusts. We have, I think, maybe 20 or 25 across the whole country. They would have more than that just in California or a small state. So fostering small land trusts, I think, is very important. Indigenous protected areas are already going well, and I think they can be promoted and funded, and having First Nations people back on country is extremely valued for multiple reasons. And then I'll briefly say, in the marine world, our software, Mark Sand, did all the rezoning of the Great Barrier Reef and builds most of the marine protected area systems in the world. That's our software from our lab at UQ. Where are the gaps in the marine protected area system in Queensland? Let's not forget about the sea. So we rezoned after much blood, sweat and tears Moreton Bay when Minister Powell was in office. And we're doing stuff at Great Sandy, but nothing on the Gold Coast, nothing on the Sunshine Coast, nothing in the Gulf of Carpentaria. So we need to finish the park system. The park system is important in the sea, and again, representing all the ecosystem types are important. So they're standard, they're what I consider to be low-hanging fruit on the park system, but there's other interesting options. For example, would the National Parks Association of Queensland be happy for multi-use national parks, let's say in the Channel Country, which is under threat from fracking and gas and oil, that involve low levels of grazing in those parks? Could you still call them a IUCN 4 or 6 national park and allow them to, as long as you could be sure that biodiversity was improving, water quality was improving, and carbon was being sequestered? If you had the data to prove all those 3 things, would you be happy with a low level of grazing in a, well, let's not call it a national park, let's call it a protected area? So that could happen any time now. In fact, I remember when I was Chief Scientist, the department came to me sheepishly saying we really need to reduce buffel grass in and around Epping State Forest where the northern hairy-nosed wombats are. And they wanted to use cattle to do it because they saw that it was a fire risk, and if there was a big fire going through there, and they'd spent 3 years trying to put the case, and they were very tentative, they were very nervous. They thought, almost all people, environmentalists like me, will say cows in a park, or a few cows in the park reducing, that's terrible, and they'd scream and yell. And I said, no, why didn't you do this 3 years ago? You've got the data, you've done the science, it's not a disaster. So I think we need to take a more liberal view of what is a protected area and actually delivering the outcomes we can get. And I'm going to challenge you even more, and this may be slightly distressing. My favourite bird watching spot is Oxley Creek Common. Oxley Creek Common, it's 100 hectares in the middle of the suburbs, behind the Rockley Market. It was once a Department of Agriculture research station. Anybody go there 30 years ago when it was a Department of Agricultural research station? Anybody probably drove past Sherwood Road and looked to the left? It was pretty well grazed to the dirt. There's about 4 trees left in 100 hectares. There's a few mangroves along the creek. They made it a park 20 years ago. The bird list is bigger than Lamington's bird list. The bird list in 100 hectares of weed-filled, degraded mess. Now, the birds are not as important. There's no doubt about that. We don't have rifle birds and Albert's lyrebirds, what we've got. But we've still got a bigger bird list. As many people go there bird watching as Lamington. Department of Environment would never think of making this a park. But if we were in the United States or in the United Kingdom, we would be managing this for an urban wetland and creating habitat. And maybe we could convince some black-necked storks to breed there by making some islands in the swamp, getting rid of the tilapia, removing the weeds, improving the habitat. There were bandicoots there for a while. Why can't we fence it off and reintroduce some wallabies and bandicoots in this urban place that hundreds of people can visit every day? In fact, they're visiting it so much I'm getting annoyed because I like bird watching there, and now there's too many bird watchers there. It's quite annoying. But it's become an incredibly popular spot. And it's full of biodiversity. And interestingly, if I took a conservative view of that park, what would we do? The old school ecologists, and this is me 30 years ago, I would have said, let's restore it to exactly what it was. What was it? It was Melaleuca, probably Tereticornis woodland, I think there was some cabbage tree palms there, a bit of rainforest in pockets. We put it all back. If I did that now, about half of the interesting bird diversity would disappear. Because what's there has worked out how to live there. Wedge-tailed eagles turn up, swamp hares. 19 birds of prey have been recorded from Oxley Creek Common. 19 different species of bird of prey. Plum-headed finches, all these weird things. So we need to take a more liberal view of what conservation is. And if we're in the United Kingdom, if you were to say, I'm sitting there in England, I'm going to return everything back to a pre-European extent. I don't know what, there is no pre-European, to a pre-people extent. Well, what is the United Kingdom without people? It was actually under a ton of ice, so you could put it back to ice. What if there were people had never arrived? It would be continuous, more or less deciduous forest. And that would also wipe out more than half their species. More than half of their species, if it was just continuous deciduous forests. All their heaths are created by all their heathers, all their downlands, a lot of their wetlands are created by human interactions with nature. So I think we can think more about what do we want the world to look like. Obviously, first responsibility, if there's intact habitat, stop it being destroyed. Now, I won't go on too much about that. We wrote a report for the government on that, about how to stop land clearing in Queensland, which is way too high. We delivered it to them in January. They haven't released it because I have no idea. So my life is all about protecting existing habitat. But I think when I was young, I massively underestimated the opportunities for habitat restoration and the diversity you can create through habitat restoration. So going back to our threatened species, what can we all do for threatened species? And you might think, well, it's very, very hard. Northern hairy-nosed wombats, you need permits. There's very few of them. You need to be a specialist working on those things. But there's one group of threatened species which is more than half the list that every person in this room can do something about, and it's threatened plants. Most of the Australian threatened plant species list is plants, most of it. And in South Australia, we started a threatened plant action group 20 years ago. They're still going strong. There's a friends group in parks that's been operating for 50 years. Most of their activities in all these parks and in and around those parks on roadsides is protecting and restoring plants that have often declined down to a handful of individuals. And it's the perfect place for the community to be involved in conservation. First of all, fencing, protecting, keeping livestock out of those places, collecting seed, growing them, replanting them. One of my favourites is a spiridium, very innocuous little plant near the Coorong, and it was down literally to 3 individuals on a roadside. And the herbarium in South Australia got them, they gave them to the Wilderness High School, and they planted out 500 on their property near that place. So you can actually recover, anybody in this room can recover a threatened plant in your lifetime. There's about 1,200 in Australia, so we just need 1,200 people to stand up. And I know some of this is happening already in the granite belt. Often, why isn't it happening, and without being too pejorative about this, it's often because the government is in our way. The government is in our way. So it's very hard to get permission to do this. So one of the very, very few things I did as Chief Scientist was convince the state government to set up threatened plant action groups across the state, but engage the community, not wall them off and keep them away, just like Friends of Parks. Don't say that conservation is a government activity and you need to stay somewhere else, you can't be involved. Welcome the public in. Help them propagate these plants. Help them plant them out. Help them do the management on the land. And as you know, there is now Friends of Parks in Queensland. You know, it's 50 years too late. But this is the only way it's going to happen, because the government isn't going to save our threatened species. They're not. Because that's demonstrably true, because they never have, right? In Queensland, they can afford to work, of the 1,000 species they should be working on, they're probably working on about 50. So the other 950, they just listed a whole heap of crayfish, these freshwater crayfish. I think they just listed 16 species of crayfish. It's a nightmare. And how would you employ enough public servants to understand the ecology of all these crayfish, I think half of them are in Queensland, all up and down. You see them up in Lamington. Many of them are vulnerable, endangered or critically endangered. It needs good natural history from good citizens, and then it often requires good stewardship and husbandry of those organisms. Again, a little bit more difficult for animals because you need special permits and other things, but with plants it's easy. So there's enormous opportunities, I think, for people to be engaged in threatened species. It just means that we need to get the Queensland government to open the door. And I'm going to say something quite pointed now. When I arrived here in 2000, 23 years ago, I came from South Australia. The Environment Minister in South Australia, and remember these numbers, the Environment Minister and the Environment Department had 125 consultative committees and advisory groups reporting through to the Environment Department. You might think that's democracy gone mad. That's Adelaide in South Australia. When I got here, there were 4, as far as I could remember, standing advisory committees. And I was on one, I've been on 2 for a while, and they both got disbanded because I think we were too annoying. It could be me. There was a threatened species committee, there was a vegetation committee, and, we just did a big vegetation report. One of our reports was put back the standing committee to give you expert advice. But it's not just that. It's beekeepers groups, it's forestry groups, it's parks groups, all those groups that are working with government in continuous standing committees. All these marine park systems, they should all have a community-based, stakeholder-based expert standing committee working with the government to make decisions. That's democracy, right? Democracy is not voting every 4 years. If you think that's democracy, then talk to my wife, who studies ancient Greek and ancient Greek literature and society. Democracy is everybody having a say about every issue. A little bit tricky, and of course in ancient Greece it was every man who had property, which is not quite democracy. It's actually a downside better than what we have now, because our governments at all levels are not letting us into decision making. So advocating for a seat at the table on standing committees is one thing that has to happen and reform in this state as quickly as possible, because that is what democracy is. It is what democracy is. If you're on any of those committees, well done, congratulations. But we should continually be advocating for more close involvement, again, at all levels of government. I'm just going to throw in a couple more and then take some questions. And a lot of Queensland's most interesting biodiversity is, because we have some topography, is on the top of the mountain. And those of you who like frogs, nursery frogs, I think it's 7 species of nursery frogs that are right on the top of wet tropics mountains. There's 20 bird species in those temperate rainforests. Those crayfish are generally on tops of mountains. There's a couple of little antechinus, tiny little marsupial carnivores that are restricted to 1 or 2 or 3 mountaintops scattered down the east coast of Australia. Under 2 or 3 degrees warming, you basically have to go up about 100 or 200 metres every degree. So they should be going up 300 to 500 metres. And when they go 300 to 500 metres, where are they? They don't exist. And a lot of those habitats, and those of you who probably do go hiking into these misty places, there is mist. And we don't call them cloud forests so much in Australia. They do in Mexico and they do in Peru. Cloud forests, that is part of the functioning of those ecosystems. If you don't have that mist, those ecosystems do not function properly. And almost surely most of these species are dependent, and that mist layer is going to go up as well. So what are we going to do about them? If they're just 3 degrees, let's 3 degrees of warming going to go off the top of them. Any suggestions? So we have this science in ecology called assisted migration. Assisted migration is we're just going to grab them and stick them to where we think they can live. So maybe those wet tropics things, we could bung them into Lamington and northern New South Wales. Some of our things here, maybe they should go to Barrington Tops. What about some golden bowerbirds? Who'd like to see a golden bowerbird in Lamington? Controversial question, right? But if they're disappearing, we know the wet tropics, mammals and birds and frogs are doing really badly, despite, I mean, that's large, there's no, logging stopped a long time ago, the protected area system is quite good, there's restoration ongoing, but they're in decline still. We've done the protection. So national parks are great, but they're not the be-all and end of conservation, because things happen outside them. Fires come from outside, climate change, cyclones, disease, chytrid. All these things are happening. Myrtle rust is threatening 20 of our endemic rainforest trees. If myrtle rust wipes out, and you should get Rod Fensham to talk about myrtle rust, that will be the biggest tree extinction pretty well the world's ever seen, because myrtle rust attacks every myrtaceae, particularly rainforest myrtaceae. You can't stop myrtle rust. It's rust. It's already colonised the entire eastern seaboard. It's a disease that stops those species. So we're going to have to put them somewhere else, and we're going to have to put them in places where they're going to be able to live. And if we wait till there's only 20 golden bowerbirds left, it's going to be tough and it'll probably fail. It's probably going to be tough and we're probably going to fail. So I continually, we've written many papers about this. Ove Hochulberg, myself, wrote a paper about assisted migration 15 years ago, saying let's start doing it now and seeing if it works. So let's say plants first. But we have to try it. If we don't try these things, more adventurous, it'll be too late and there'll be 20 left, and there'll be 20 left, they'll be inbred, and it'll be almost impossible to recover them. So I suppose what I'm saying overall is we actually need to be a little bit more aggressive and less conservative as conservationists. We need to be able to go to governments and say, these are the things that have to happen. They're a little bit outside the box. They're not your traditional kill invasive species, get rid of the weeds, make more national parks activities. These are more like, let's take quite aggressive interventions. They have actually done some. Western swamp tortoise. You should read about the western swamp tortoise in Perth. It was down to about 70 individuals, and they've tried to relocate it to a place because the places where it's in, on the Swan Coastal Plain, are now too dry and don't have enough rain. And anybody who knows their climate facts know that Perth, Western Australia, has been suffering the biggest declines in rainfall of anywhere else in Australia. But unless we get people advocating for these things, I can tell you if I go, they just say, no, it's too hard, can't have the permits. And I'll give you another interesting, odd and bizarre thing about this thought experiment. If I ask permission to take some golden bowerbirds, or what else do you want from the wet tropics? I'd like a fern wren, would be nice. They're cute. And said, can I bring them to Lamington and breed them up? No, you can't have the permits. It's all illegal. There'd be, I think, even if we started asking for those things now, we'd be 10 or 20 years away. We'd need to first consult with the traditional owners of that land as well, because they might find all the assisted migration is also potentially confronting from their perspective. Strangely enough, what can I do tomorrow? I can go to a nursery in Atherton, buy 500 species, 20,000 rainforest trees and shrubs, and buy a property right next to Lamington and plant them all. I could do the biggest biogeographic experiment in the planet pretty well, moving a whole heap of rainforest trees 2,000 kilometres south, putting right next to a national park. Is that a good idea? I shouldn't really be able to do it. I can do that legally. I touch one feather on the edge of a golden bowerbird and then I'm in jail. Well, hopefully I'm in jail. So we haven't really thought a lot of these rules and laws through, have we? So many of our laws to protect nature stop us protecting nature. The laws we created to protect nature haven't worked. Since the EPBC Act was created in 1999 and rolled out, can you tell me that 7 million hectares of habitat in Queensland has been destroyed with known threatened species? That's a piece of legislation that says you can't do anything that has a significant impact on a threatened species. 7 million hectares of habitat have been destroyed. What's that? That's sort of like half the agricultural districts of South Australia have been destroyed in 20 years where there was known threatened species. What did our legislation do? What did the Nature Conservation Act in Queensland do? It did nothing. But then if we want to do something good, like let's go and save this plant, animal or bird, it's almost impossible because the law stops us. So, we need better laws, and I'll end on a positive note now. This federal government has agreed to reform the nature laws, and it's your time to be part of that reform, because they're going to put out some bills and we're going to get one crack at it, and it probably won't be reformed again for 25 years. So this is a once in a lifetime, once in a generation time to reform those laws. They're talking about nature repair bills, which is new markets for nature. Is that good? New markets for nature? Should we be getting business and philanthropy to be funding all the conservation or not? Some people think it's a terrible idea, some people think it's a great idea, some people just don't know much about it. But those two pieces of legislation are going to be transformative. They're happening as we speak. Queensland itself as a state needs to overhaul all its legislation because it's ancient, and it needs to actually fit the fact that since those acts were created 40 or 50 years ago, the world has changed so much. I'll give you one last story about my own incompetence and then I'll take questions. My wife and I created the Adelaide Plains Flora Association. Adelaide has been flattened. There's very little vegetation left in Adelaide because it's a little flat and green and fertile. And there were about 12 hectares left, and we were there stewarding those 12 hectares, revegetating, finding little populations of plants. We never moved. We had a rule then, this is 30, 40 years ago, you could never get seed from more than 5 kilometres away. That would be insanity because, you need to protect the local gene pool. The world's already warmed. Australia's already warmed 1.5 degrees, which is 200 kilometres. So we should have been collecting our seed from Burra or Clare, 200 kilometres north. We weren't. Already organisations are getting seeds from more climate-resilient places. But an emu can actually eat a ruby saltbush berry and run 20 kilometres and poop it out. So I don't know why we were so obsessed with the 5 kilometres. But, bottom line is we need to quickly move away from nature is this fragile thing. The only place we can do is wall it off and keep it away. We can't tamper with it, can't move it. We can do so many interesting things, whether it's restoring oxycommon, working on threatened plants, advocating for more aggressive conservation interventions. The department here was completely anti any form of assisted migration and any form of captive breeding of any species for the last 30 years. They've tried to stop it all. Slowly people are realising that's not working. We actually do need to work hard. I'm not a big fan of captive breeding because it's expensive and difficult, but if you're going to lose a species and that's the only alternative, we shouldn't have got to the point where captive breeding was necessary. Let's go and do it and let's invest in it and let's get as many people as involved as possible. Thank you very much.